The ACC, no, I'm not going to do it. Let the numbers speak for themselves. We shall see what the numbers have to say. Welcome into the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by for the best in discussion, debate, and analysis. A couple of weeks ago, there were conference power rankings. So those are the rankings of the teams within the conferences. Check them out, including the mighty ACC. What we are doing this week is what we do each and every off-season, conference rankings. But before we can compare the conferences, we have to look at each and every conference based on the results against the rest of college football. So we are showing you all the results, every result in the 2024 regular season and postseason taken into consideration, but mostly the power conference matchups. As we march through the ACC, let's consider here at the Voice of College Football, we just don't spitball it. We just don't say, well, the ACC sucks because they went 2-11 in postseason play. 2-9 against power conference teams, 0-2 against a group of 5. Because some would say, obviously, postseason games are tainted because of opt-outs and motivation factors. Okay, let's look at the regular season. We're going to take it all in totality, but not even the surface records can be taken seriously because we've got to delve deeper. Who is winning and losing these games from these conferences against like-seeded or not-so-like-seeded teams from the other conferences? Meaning, the win-loss record for all these conferences means something, but it's got to be put into context. Therefore, we introduce the seeding factor. If a champion, number one seed from a particular conference, defeats the number one seed and champion from another conference, that's meaningful. Absolutely. And that should have a certain weight. But if the number one team in a conference defeats the 15th best team in another conference, well, we're still going to count it, but to a much lesser degree. The weight has to be given much less consideration because that's an expected win, obviously. Or if the number 10 team in a particular conference defeats the number 2 seed in another conference, well, that speaks well of that particular conference that gained a 8 seed difference win. When we look at the seedings in the ACC, they look like this. Clemson at 1, SMU at 2, Miami at 3, Syracuse at 4. We're going by the records in the conference. And of course, tiebreakers are head-to-head with Louisville 5 on down the line with Georgia Tech, Duke. Those are the teams that finish with above 500 records, at least 5-3 in the ACC. Then some 4-4 ACC teams in Virginia Tech, Boston College, Pitt, NC State, North Carolina, Virginia all went at 3-5 in the ACC. They are the 10 through 13 seeds. Cal at number 14, a 2-6 team, as well as Wake and Stanford. And of course, Florida State only won one game in the conference. That was over Cal, and they went 2-10 as the number 17 seed. So let's break down the wins of the ACC against the power conferences and also the losses, taking the seed factor into consideration. These are the wins for the ACC. Number 2, SMU defeated number 6, TCU by 24 points. Also a 24-point win by Miami over Florida. Seems like an impressive win for the ACC, but consider Miami's a 3rd seed in the ACC. Florida's a 10 seed out of the SEC with a 4-4 record. Syracuse, a 10-3 football team, as a 4 seed, defeated Washington State in a bowl game, 52-35. But let's also consider Washington State had a bunch of opt-outs, lost their quarterback and their head coach. But we have to take the results as they stand in reality. Louisville with a couple of non-conference wins against Washington and Kentucky. Of course, they won the bowl game against Washington by 1 point. Duke and Northwestern, that was an overtime game. Duke, a 7 seed, Northwestern just a 16 seed at 2-7 in the Big Ten. Boston College with a win against Michigan State, but they should win that game as a 5-seeded higher team. Pitt won 2 games for the ACC out of conference over Cincinnati and West Virginia. Very like-seeded games. If we're looking for really impressive wins by the ACC, there aren't any outstanding wins here because the conference did not pull off any remarkable upsets outside the conference. The only seeded upsets would be Pitt as a 10 seed, defeated West Virginia, a 9 seed. And then, of course, North Carolina on opening weekend, 12 seed, defeated what eventually was a good Minnesota team at 8-5, 5-4 in the Big Ten. So that's a 12 seed out of the ACC, defeating an 8 seed out of the Big Ten. And then you see Cal with a couple wins despite all their struggles in the conference, defeated Auburn and Oregon State. We assigned Oregon State with a 12 seed as a 5-7 team in a weak Pac-2/12. Now let's look at the losses from the ACC, and there's a slew of them to look at. 24 against the Power 5, 15 during the regular season, 9 during a disastrous bowl season. And of course, Clemson played most of these big games, trounced by Georgia. They also lost to South Carolina. If you're looking at that funny 6.5 seed for South Carolina, here's the deal. In the SEC, you had a logjam of 6 teams tied at 5-3. So I did not think that it would be equitable or fair to designate them and have one particular team be a 4 seed and the other one a 9 seed. So if you average out the seeds, you get 6.5 for all the 5-3 teams in the SEC. Well, Clemson also lost to Texas, of course, in the college football playoff. SMU with a loss against BYU. That was a 2 versus 3 seed, as was SMU against Penn State in the college football playoff. You had Miami losing to Iowa State in the bowl game. You had Louisville losing to Notre Dame by a touchdown. Also Georgia Tech against Notre Dame, as the Irish, of course, factor in heavily to the ACC's non-conference games, playing 5 times against the ACC. Georgia Tech had a rough time with Vandy and Georgia. So right there we see the seeding difference. Georgia Tech, a 6 seed. They lose to Vanderbilt, a 12 seed out of the SEC. Not a good look, not a good seeding comparison there, but Georgia Tech hanging with Georgia, so that's an understandable loss. And of course, that was that 8 overtime epic battle against their arch rivals. So Georgia wins the game, but Georgia Tech, that's understandable. A 6 seed losing to a 1 seed out of the SEC. Virginia Tech, the 8 seed, loses a couple games out of conference, actually make it 3 for the Hokies in representing the ACC. They lose to Vandy, Minnesota, and Rutgers. Also, Duke with a bowl loss against Ole Miss. Boston College lost to Missouri and Nebraska. Way back when, in September, NC State looked to be a contender, a top 25 team, when they played Tennessee and got completely mauled 51-10 in that game. But NC State finished as the 11 seed. Virginia, the 13 seed. So here we go. The Notre Dame loss is not going to be taken that heavily in our evaluation because Notre Dame's a 1 seed. Even though they don't play in a conference, they went to the national championship game. They're 14-2. They would be a 1 seed, and they took out Virginia. Not a big deal there. But Virginia, 13 seed, loses to Maryland, a 17 seed in the Big Ten at 1-8. And there we see losses by Wake Forest. Stanford loses a couple out of the conference, and Florida State, of course, was a disaster, losing to Notre Dame and to Florida. Now let's give this some further context as we look at seeding differences, point differentials, and then also winning percentages, because that tells us a whole lot about the quality of the teams from the ACC winning these games against the other conferences and also losing these games, and how they compare in winning percentage against the teams that they defeated and lost to in the SEC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12. So in the 12 wins by the ACC against the other 3 conferences, they had a seeding advantage of 39 spots. The reason I made that a negative is I wanted to get that into everybody's heads, that we're communicating that this is a negative for the ACC, not a positive. We put a plus by the seeding advantage here. So those ACC teams that won the 12 games, they were a total compilation of 39 seeds better than their opponents in the other 3 conferences. Meanwhile, in the 24 losses, those other conference teams were 66 spots above the ACC. So all of that makes sense. Better teams generally beat lesser teams. Point differential here, we see that the ACC won these 12 games by 144 points per game. Now, in terms of point differential, we see the ACC won these 12 games by 144 points. That's a nifty even 12 points per game. Remember your multiplication tables, 12 times 12 is 144. The ACC lost 24 times to the Power 5 by 410 points. That's an average loss of 17.1. You can pretty much thank the bottom of the ACC of getting trounced. Wake lost to Ole Miss 40-6. Stanford lost to Notre Dame 49-7. Florida State lost to Notre Dame 52-3 and lost to Florida 31-11. On and on. NC State with a 41-point loss against Tennessee, but that's pretty similar to other conferences. Your bad teams get trounced. Now let's look at the winning percentages. This is interesting. So these are the teams that won the games for the ACC against the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the SEC. They went 97-60, won nearly 62% of their games. They defeated teams that were under 500. So teams that win 62% of their games should defeat teams that win 48% of their games. But they did do it 12 consecutive times. Now, these ACC teams, it's really interesting here because we're not going to see this look in the other conferences. They actually didn't fare well in their own conferences. The Clemsons and SMUs, the teams at the top of the ACC, lost their non-conference games. Clemson was 0-3. SMU was 0-2, losing to BYU, losing to Penn State. So the best teams in the ACC, the two championship game participants, went 0-5 outside the conference. So it was the bottom of the conference in many instances that won these games. Cal won 2 games outside the conference. North Carolina won a game. Pitt went 3-5 in the ACC, but they won 2 out-of-conference games. So the ACC's 12 wins against the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the SEC, half of those were wins by sub-500 teams in the ACC. Therefore, the record by these ACC teams, and in a sense, it's to the ACC's credit, although their elite teams, quote-unquote elite teams, could not get it done outside the conference. 51-45, 53% winning percentage for the teams that won these games for the ACC, but they didn't defeat really good teams. The teams that they beat only won 40% of their games in conference. Their best wins outside the conference would be a win against TCU, a 6-3 team in the Big 12, and West Virginia 5-4, Minnesota 5-4. Those would be the 3 best teams that the ACC defeated: TCU, West Virginia, and Minnesota, and possibly Washington, a 4-5 team, and also Florida, of course, with a loss to Miami. In the losses, the ACC went 162-147. Those ACC teams that lost those 24 games won 52% of their games, but they were actually better in conference. They won almost 55% of their games in conference and lost 24 consecutive games to teams that were only about 2.5 percentage points higher. So teams that won 55% of their games in the conference lost 24 games, went 0-24 against teams from the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the SEC that won just over 57% of their games. Not a good look for the ACC here, although the overall record for these losses is pretty darn impressive at 726. That's the Notre Dame factor. So the ACC lost, 5 games against Notre Dame, and Notre Dame obviously went 14-2, so multiply that by 5, and you've got a 70-10 run by the Irish, factoring into that overall record of 246-93. When we add it up for the ACC, they played a whole lot of football against the rest of the nation, including the FCS in the group of 5. 81 games, 49-32. The reason there, they had a lot of teams go to bowl games. They also have got a lot of teams with 17, so that's more than the SEC and the Big 12 by 1. Then also consider they only play 8 conference games. Therefore, that's 17 more games played by the ACC against the rest of college football. 12-24 against the Power 5, so that's 2-9 in postseason play, so that's 10-15 in regular season play. That 21-8 mark against the group of 5 isn't necessarily a good number. It looks good on the surface, 21-8. We think in sports, 21-8, that's a pretty good record. No, not against a group of 5, and you will see that as we march through the other conferences. And against the FCS, 16-0. Nobody lost any games against the FCS this year. There were no North Dakota State upsets or anything like that this time around. And getting back to the group of 5, this kind of outlines where the ACC stands, because obviously there are Group of 5 teams that are better than Power 5 teams, so we don't want to leave this out, but we're not going to go through all the metrics. Just notable games against Group of 5 for the ACC. Wins for Miami against South Florida. Syracuse beat UNLV and UConn. Good wins for Syracuse, and of course UNLV almost made the college football playoff. Duke defeated UConn 26-20. Virginia Tech over a good Marshall team. Boston College barely squeaked by Western Kentucky. So that I note, not because Western Kentucky was good this year, but because the ACC had some close calls in these games. And Wake defeated UConn. That was a close game as well. A lot of close calls for the ACC in winning some of these games. Now, here's a slew of losses for the ACC. Toledo beat Pitt. East Carolina beat NC State. Man, that's got to be an embarrassment in that part of the country. North Carolina lost a bowl game to UConn. James Madison defeated North Carolina, scoring 70 points. Cal lost to UNLV. Wake lost to Louisiana. Stanford lost to San Jose State. Another embarrassment for that region when you got the massive school that loses to the Group of 5. And then, of course, Florida State lost to everybody, including Memphis. That's the rundown on the ACC. What does it all mean? Well, I think you get an indication here. However, you don't get the complete look until we wrap up with the SEC and the Big Ten, the next two videos. Then we put it all together to make the big comparison right here at the Voice of College Football. Please like and subscribe. Support us here because we love talking college football with you. And we are ready to announce our off-season schedule, so be looking out for that. And, of course, we want your comments down below right here at the Voice of College Football.